Okay, welcome to You Talking with Gregg. I'm super psyched today to talk with my good friend Jordan Hall. Been eager to get him on the show, but he's been traveling around, and we haven't had a chance. We connected a little while ago. I really look forward to getting caught up. Welcome, Jordan, to coming and sharing your wisdom.
Well, I'm sharing my time. We'll see about wisdom.
Yeah. Right. Well, I get him excited. We'll see what happens, but let's not set the bar too high.
Yeah. So, in the past, one of the places that we hit that just struck me as being potentially interesting was in your particular theory, the notion of the singularity has a lot more meaning to it, has a lot more sort of context, and has a certain level of being predicted, right? It's not just a kind of a statistical observation. There's an underlying dynamic that would predict that this would occur, and in some sense point at what it is and what it might mean to say something after.
Yep.
And I can say that from my first person perspective, I notice a quickening. I notice almost like a palpable acceleration in the rate of change of the context.
Yep.
In many different ways, which of course we could sort of tease those different ways out if we'd like.
Right.
And that might be an interesting thing to talk about. It's certainly different than many of the topics that seem to be circulating. So perhaps
beautiful. Love it. All right. Wonderful. Yeah. So the real short snapshot of my own take on the singularity. So as people listening will know, in 1996, actually in parallel to you, I later learned that I was grappling with this issue of justification. It's a really intense concept and really a way to delineate the human person layer from our primate self. It's like a language, proposition, question, answer, justification. Oh my God, justification systems, and they're all over the damn place, and takes off in culture over the last 100,000 years, shoots out as a plane of, of existence and complex adaptive behavior, all that. And then I'm stoned one night in 1997 and out falls the tree of knowledge. Okay. Just the upside down cones, a circle, and then boom, matter popped out of energy and life popped out of matter, and mind, animal mind behavior popped out of life. And then culture, persons popped out of animal primates. And that changed my life. It's like a fundamental reorganization of a schematic for natural science in the world and big history, or whatever we want to call it. And then for a while, I was like, well, people would ask me like over the year or after that, hey, I found this. And I'm like, well, what are those things? These cones, what do they actually, represent? It took me a while to determine. This was a vision, not a propositional network. I mean, it fell out of me intuitively, and then I drew it. And some aspects of my system knew it, but other aspects of delineating propositional logos didn't. It was like, what the fuck really are those things? Okay. And then over time, I was like, well, life creates this complexity building feedback loop in the process by which the genetic material is storing information, is regulating protein production, and then variation, selection, and retention across various levels. Well, that gives rise to this whole tree of life. Okay. And then that nervous system is coding across various elements. It's then engaged in the behavior of the animal as a whole. B.F. Skinner called that behavioral selection. And it's that selection, variation, retention, and the way in which information is then coded, generalized into sort of learning, evolving behavior patterns in animals. So and then you get humans, and then we're processing the linguistic information and then communicating that in networks. And essentially what emerges then is this, these are out of matter comes these complex adaptive planes of existence that are networked together as a function of information processing within the system, if you want to say that, and communication between nodes. So that's what those fucking codes are. And one's at the genetic cell level, to give life dimension, one's at the neuron animal level to give mind dimension, and one's at the symbol person level in culture and justification systems. Okay. Well, if each one of those is a function of the emergence of laying down a information processing communication network system, and that results in a qualitative shift in complex adaptive behavior. And you know, the natural patterning systems of our little human minds as well. It's 1, it's 2, it's 3. Wouldn't there be a 4th? Okay. And then you're like, you're in the middle, this is 1998, 1999, and you're sort of like, so is there a merging process of an information processing system and communication network that seems to be growing at a higher level of organization than cultural justification? And you're like, boom, fucking 20th century, we just laid down the internet. We built artificial intelligence. We're interfacing now with computational devices. And that bridge between the digital and our culture justification certainly looks a hell of a lot like the way, say, jellyfish looked in 700 million years ago before the fucking Cambrian explosion turned them into full-fledged animal behavior scurrying around the world. Okay. So it's like, we're looking from this angle, then you see the 20th century is like laying down a jellyfish network that's pretty quickly going to jump into some sort of centralized control system. The digital world is going to then create an information processing communication network that is, I didn't have the language, but somebody like Stuart Kaufman would say that TAP, the adjacent possibility space in this network, is fucking going to explode. And it's going to then fundamentally shift everything that came before. And it's going to create acceleration and chaos and order, chaos, dialectic dynamics. And it's going to be exciting and a shit show in the 21st century. It's like, that's what it basically what it says. So it's like, oh my God, there's sort of a really clear logic to a 5th joint point. Each one of the, from energy to matter, that's 1, matter to life, life to mind, mind to culture, and then culture to digital or whatever. And that becomes then the 5th joint point. And that very clearly is what people like Ray Kurzweil were seeing as the singularity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One characteristic of that would be to point out that I've heard this phrase said a lot of times in the last couple of 18 months, which is in nature, there are no exponential curves. There are S curves that appear exponential for a period of time.
Totally.
And I would say, hey, the singularity is it's not going to go to infinity. It's an S curve. And we're in a part of it which is going like this, but it will reach a point. And when it reaches that point, we've actually just shifted to a new, call it kind of a qualitative transformation.
Exactly. If you look at the tree of knowledge, I'll just say that's really, if you those cones that do this, those are the S cones coming out of the thing and then across. So that's 100%.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And so I'm noticing right now, I'm downloading, it's been months since we've actually had a meaningful conversation, and maybe months since we had a conversation at all. And I'm having to download your vocabulary, your system, your structure, even like your style of speech and language. I'm trying to catch up right now. I was also taken by the fact that the thing that came up was TAP, Stuart Kaufman TAP. And then a few moments later, you brought it in TAP. And so maybe we can, so for the next maybe 2 to 5 minutes, what I'm proposing is both an exploration of a particular domain of inquiry, but also something like a protocol for impedance matching to bring us closer into sync.
Perfect.
So that we can actually hit a joint point and performatively, qualitatively level up.
Beautiful.
Okay, so TAP. What's interesting about this notion of TAP is, in many ways, because of the way that Stuart thinks and is approaching it, it's hyper abstract. But of course, the actuality of any given search is hyper concrete, and it's actually happening. And so if you look at the exploration of a particular soup of molecules in kind of chemistry space, that soup of molecules does not have within it Stravinsky's Rite of Spring as part of its TAP. Right? Its TAP consists of minor modifications or modification shifts in chemistry space. And I think it's very important to kind of grasp the particularities.
Did I say the adjacent possible just for people to listening? So the TAP stands for, maybe I said that or not, but I couldn't remember. So let me just say it. The adjacent possible is the acronym. TAP is the acronym for it.
In fact, let's go ahead and recapitulate it, because I think it's going to end up being a very important tool, because it feels like that's one of the mechanism independent or mechanism invariant constructs that is driving the whole process, and each stage of the process is the mechanism dependent specifics.
Yes,
right? I think that's largely.
I think that's a nicely way of saying it. Beautiful.
So the concept of the adjacent possible initially came out of Stewart's investigation of complex dynamic systems in chemistry, and noticing certain curves, which actually tend to look like S curves, and then he put together a theory that essentially looked at it and said, okay, I seem to have a kind of a recursive process where there's a kind of a bunch of possible things that could happen. I think the metaphor that he originally used is like a garage full of pieces.
Okay. And
I can imagine that there's a bunch of different possible things that could happen if I put the pieces together. So that's the adjacent possible is if I take component A, B, and C, and I tried the different combinations, A, B, A, C, B, C, right? I've got that number of combinations. I might notice that something happens when I put, let's say, B, C together that forms a new kind of thing that has kind of qualitative reality. So if I stick cilia on the outside of a cell wall, suddenly I've got mobility, which just really is, it's got durability in an evolutionary and evolving landscape.
Perfect.
So now if I kind of, next move, now I've got A, B, C, and D. D, it consists in this case of the BC combo. So I've still got B as itself and C as itself, but the BC combo is now a thing, which I'm going to call D. 1 second. My dog found himself on the wrong side of the door. Okay, so what ends up happening is you get this an increase in the number of objects that can be subject to combination and testing and recombination. Because every time that you discover one, you still have the ones you used to have. So you're just increasing the size. And as we know, it's a geometric expansion. The number of possible combinations of 4 objects is, whatever that math is, 5, 6 each time. Right? So you get this geometric expansion in the space of possible combinations. So now the problem has to do with the fact that there's a certain amount of energy involved in any given experiment. Right? At the end of the day, it's purely combinatorial, or what would you call it? There's a particular term for this, but it's it's trial by error. You essentially don't know what's going to happen when you put A and B together until you put A and B together. So you got to test them. So as I begin to move through the threshold of exploring what's actually happening in the possibility space, I've got 2 very distinct things that are happening. One is I periodically get overwhelmed by the amount of combinations that I could possibly try to put together. Actually, there's 3 now that I think about it, and this is the point. And the third is going to be where we get looped back to your reference. The second is there's actually a change in the context of what's happening every time the possibility space changes, right? So now we have to realize we're not actually in a garage, we're in an evolving system. So when you introduce cilia to the outside of a membrane, you didn't just create a new object. You created a whole new dynamic, right? The world is a world now that has things that are moving around, and that changes the whole sort of characteristic context. But then the third is sometimes some of these combinations give rise to things that can search the space more efficiently, right? And that ends up being a fundamental characteristic of the underlying system, which is, on one hand, I've got the size of the space of possibility. And on the second, I have the capacity to search that space of possibility to locate actualities that have, and then the final third is just straight evolution. And then there's a relationship between where are you in the evolutionary frontier in terms of competitions for scarce resources.
Uh-huh.
So that's the story of the adjacent possible.
Great.
And to map that back onto your frame, what you're pointing out or noticing is that there's a dominant, almost like what are these called, like an strata, like these stratifying layers that are associated with discovery of big systemic upgrades and by the way, it's really interesting, in potential first, which then become realized in actual at the level of the information processing piece. So I have an information processing piece which is strictly kinetic. Then the development of chemistry, which includes specifically the notions of structure, geometry, and catalysts, radically increases the information processing capacity of that domain in relation to just strictly kinetic. Then I start developing things like nervous systems, right, which have the orienting basis of actually being able to move in space in relationship with signals, right? So it reduces pure interaction into theoretic or proxy-based interaction, which causes the development of the optimization of systems of sensing and systems of using signals to create models or proxies for, and then of course systems of moving, which radically changes the availability.
And in terms of the potential space, what I'll say is that in terms of what animals are, they become heterotrophs is the technical term, basically means they eat other things. And so then they can get up and move around and eat something else. And that's a big shift from fungi and plants, although they sort of grow into eating other things. Getting up and eating something else and sitting down is a cool potential space. In terms of the energy
and this is the key, right? So it's almost like the whole space becomes the D in my previous example.
Exactly.
Right? And what we look at is when we look inside the whole space, we realize that D actually contains a whole new set of stuff. So I have a whole, like a qualitative, I got a kind of a quantitative adjacent possible, and I have a qualitative adjacent possible.
Exactly.
And when we move into nervous system space, suddenly I've got all the things that happen in the OG field of things, but now I've got this whole new one, which is the adjacent possible in nervous system space, which has a whole new set of things that happen just in the variables of possible nervous systems.
Exactly.
And so these two movements, the quantitative and the qualitative, and this verticality of once you've developed nervous system or developed behavior or developed culture, that's it sits on top of the previous levels.
John and I agree. It's the sensory motor loop of adaptation, which is basically also in the Aristotle layer of the animal soul. It's the sensory motor loop of functional form, which gets the animal up and gets them into macro behavioral mechanical space.
So then I'm going to shift a little bit here. One other thing that came up for me was something like, so I'm not sure if this metaphor is going to work. For me, it was a point of insight. Back in the day, you may recall, there was this thing where Intel tried to promote their chips by making this canonical notion of how do they do it? Gigahertz or something like that. Remember, or the chips were promoted by how many cycles per second they could execute on. Clock speed, right? And by the way, as we sort of know, that's not really fundamental, but they were able to get some pretty good marketing mileage out of it. And one of the characteristics of clock speed is that it shifts your notion of time. So you can say, okay, I've got a sense of like objective time, which we're just going to say right for now is like, let's just call it clock time, which would even be more precise, which is atomic decay time. But on the other one, I've got information processing time. And those aren't the same, right? Because information processing time is gated by the amount of information processing functions that can be made in a particular unit of atomic decay time. Entropic and entropy time. So it's interesting to think about that in the context of the singularity. And what I would say is the singularity is a recognition that the sort of an increasing relevance, almost like a dominance of the shifting into a more and more pure abstraction of information processing time, and away from entropy or atomic time.
There's a data compression capacity that jams stuff in. One way of thinking about that. So at a phenomenological time level, when people get a really intense moments, they'll experience time as slowing. The phenomenological experience of time is slowing. What's happening to the system is it brings all its attentional mechanism to suck up and process as most information as possible in that time. And that's part of the juxtaposition of what's happening there.
Right, exactly. So nice. So there was when the internet was a little bit mature, there were these things I think called EMUs or something like that, but they're effectively emulators of old-fashioned hardware video games like Pac-Man.
Yeah, sure.
But here was one of the interesting variables is that if you didn't have the right if you didn't think about it right, you're running Pac-Man on kind of your modern or whatever contemporary computer, but it's running at a much faster clock speed. All right, so Pac-Man is suddenly running super fast. Because the original hardware didn't have a notion of clock speed as a variable. It just was running something on as if clock speed was an ontological primitive, when in fact, as it turns out, it's a variable. So if you imagine like shift back and forth, me, third person watching it, sees it going really, really fast. But if I could find some way of kind of being Pac-Man from the inside, it's moving at Pac-Man speed, right? So that's the really interesting thing. So if you recognize that there is actually two very distinct kinds of time going on. There's the time that is somehow bound by, let's just call for the moment, context. So I was using the previous terms, entropy time and atomic decay time, which is having to do with, we're gated by things like general relativity. At the very least, it's gated by things like the speed of light. But on this other side, you have something like information processing time, which is gated by the current state of the adjacent possible in the context of the capacity to actually transmit computational steps in an actualized information processing system.
Right.
And so the actual amount of kind of bits or the bandwidth of the world, the universe as we understand it. Right. So for now, I'll just assume Gaia is the only information processing system in the universe.
Totally.
Which is almost certainly wrong, but for the moment, we'll just assume that. The kind of bits per second of Gaia as an information processing system has gone up enormously since life. Right? The original amount, the baseline of just atoms doing atom stuff has stayed relatively constant, but each structural layer radically increases the amount of information processing happening inside this particular container.
Totally.
And if I just sort of drew a line just describing the amount of bits per second, I get myself the Kurzweil curve. Right? And that would be the dominant, like that's the causal factor. That's the thing. And of course, the underlying construct is that's the search of the adjacent possible. And okay, so now we get to,
I'll give a quick, so if you just want to go out in nature, watch a bee on a flower. Okay, the bee's operating at a different space-time set of constraints than the flower is.
Yeah.
Okay, so the bee's like that fast Pac-Man. The bee can, in real time, I'll often talk in real animal time. Okay, now flowers and trees do really weird, cool shit, but their the size and time it takes for them to metabolize and shift is qualitatively different than the bee bouncing around the top of the flower. So it's operating in a particular space-time speed that is qualitatively different than the flower is, even though they're both complex adaptive systems, but the bee's upgraded.
Yeah, and you can do the same thing between the flower and the sun.
Exactly.
So then we say, okay, when we're looking at this, where my mind turns to now is, okay, now what's this moment look like? This seems, no, how do I say this right? Obviously, the only thing that's actually worth considering right now. I mean, come on. It's like it's like you're sitting there at the moment of your child's birth and you're wondering, what should I be thinking about right now? Should I be like looking at Stock prices? Should I be thinking about what
The
kind of new
Eagles
car
did
I
not play
want?
well last year. Like,
No, that right there, or more specifically, you're literally at the moment of your own birth, wondering about the exactly who's going to win the next week's football game. No, this is it. This is what's up. This is by far the most, like, even every concept just blows apart. I can't even use the word most meaningful because the concept of meaning is liquid. It's fluid. It's even like vapor in the context of the of what's going on in this.
X marks the cosmic coordinate spot of the moment.
Okay, so given that orienting basis, hey everybody, what should we be looking at? This, what's happening? So what's happening at that point? You and I have talked about this a few times, but we've literally have gone around the sun at least twice since then. So let's take a look. What's happening at that point? Okay, so if we back up and just use the comp, so the hypothesis is that we can learn from the past. So far, so good. So far, we've actually been able to do a little bit of that in the existence of the universe. So we'll stick with it. And we notice that one of the things that happens is there's each joint point is a location in the possibility space of the prior joint point. Right? So we could say that behavior sits in a location in nervous system space.
Yep.
A certain location in nervous system space where the conditions have come together that give rise now to the possibility of behavior.
And I'll add the little term animal mental behavior, but that's the kind of behavior we're referring to.
Good. Yeah, thank you.
Just to be specific relative to flower behavior.
Yes, animal mental behavior, which then, of course, becomes the joint point that gives rise to culture.
Yep.
All right, so we're now looking, and one of the things that comes into my mind, and I don't really know exactly why or what is this notion of resonance or like smoothness, laminar flow as opposed to turbulent flow. If you look at like I was always taken by the morphological relationship between the ichthyosaurus and the dolphin.
Huh. Okay.
Because they're both solving for the same fundamental kinematic problem of maximum velocity for minimum energy in water. So they're going to end up looking more or less the same. Yeah? Okay. So there's something about a problem that is being solved for in, say, for example, nervous system space.
Yep.
That it reaches the equivalent of resonance, the equivalent of laminar flow in its own terms.
Beautiful.
That gives this opportunity for a radically new return. Now, I'm just going to expand on this notion of resonance because it's going to be crucial to make the leap here.
Okay.
And again, so now the visual image is the classic signal to noise ratio per unit energy in an information transmission system. So an antenna. Okay. So I have a particular antenna, and I'm broadcasting a particular signal at a particular amount of energy. And by the way, on a certain frequency. Okay.
Perfect. Okay.
Let's just make it very, very concrete. I'm broadcasting it at FM 949.
All right.
Yeah. Now, if I do a graph of the signal to noise ratio, and I'm tuning and I'm moving it across from 89 to 90 each step, obviously by tenths, because that's what I've defined. What I notice is that the noise is basically the entire system. So even though the energy is constant, the amount of energy is exactly the same, almost all that energy is converted into noise at 89 and at 90 and at 92. Somewhere around 93, I start getting some signal. Right? So the signal to noise ratio starts doing this.
Right.
And if you think about the way it sounds to your ear, you can make out that there's a channel there. It's not just stat.
That's right.
I get to 94.5. I can maybe even begin to make out the fact that there's, it's Telemundo or it's sports radio or whatever. I can begin to get some pattern starts to pop out. I get a 94.7, I can hear it. 94.9 though, right? And it's this shape, right? It's that shape. This is the thing, like this shape right here. And I flip. So if I look at my graph at 94.9, it's now not almost all signal, but it's a lot signal, right? A whole lot, like 95% signal and only 5% noise. Right. So I had a small space in the I guess this
bandwidth or whatever. bandwidth
a small change in the underlying variable, but gave rise to an enormous, like massive shift in the conversion of energy into signal, right? And the hypothesis is that's what's happening at a joint point, is that there's a signal to noise ratio going on at the mechanical level of a particular domain.
Totally.
By the way, many different locations in that where the signal is non-zero and therefore useful signal processing happens.
Right.
There's a point of something like a resonant frequency. Now I'm just like having to say it like pure metaphor right now, where there's a pop and the signal noise ratio explodes. And because the amount of energy needed to provide the basic signal of that structural level is now trivially afforded, you get this huge thing up here, which is now available for exploration of an entirely novel set of possibilities.
100%. So in concrete terms, you may see my dog Benji walking around here. His capacity to tune into this conversation is limited.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It
doesn't have the language acquisition device and system of justification that would afford him to pull the signal out of the noise in relationship to this narrative.
Exactly. His capacity to, so from let's just pound on that metaphor a little bit to blow it apart. So you've got his capacity to hear the modulation of air and perceive the fact that there is clearly sound modulation going on is better than ours. Like he can hear that shit. Right. His capacity to convert that signal into all the other steps that are living inside our signal processing mechanism is, better than a lizard and nowhere near the same as a human.
Exactly. So like probably his ears popped up when I said Benji upstairs. Right? So he's bink. He had the little cocktail party phenomenon. I've seen him because I've had that conversation, and dogs, of course, afford their capacity to make pairing to particular symbols, but the capacity for the linguistic justification and the propositional network meaning, obviously, is, they can't tone into that.
Right. Okay. So then if we apply that to this moment, we say, okay, we've been exploring culture space. Mm-hmm. And just like the previous example, there have been locations in culture space where the relative signal to noise ratio is a sort of above the base noise, which gives rise to certain sort of efficiencies or advantages in the fitness landscape for processing, creating efficient use of energy and stuff like that. And there's been something along the lines, and this, by the way, would be a very nice, again, we can kind of pivot back to Kurzweil, and we can also think about things like the what the hell happened in the West in 1600, right? There was some discovery of some particular, what's it called? A recursive reification process. So this is where each iteration actually produces its own artifact, but more meaningfully produces a attunement mechanism. And so each next generation has a higher capacity to orient more towards resonance than the previous. So each generation is its own whatever, has its own capacities in terms of the flatness of its competitive landscape. But the most important thing is it also affords a attunement closer towards the center.
Right. And I would say market forces in the way in which economics started to code energy, money energy, as well as technological developments in the modern system, there were some capacities for deeply broadening energy information through market economic money structure.
Oh, let's throw out all kinds of stuff.
I mean, right, that 100%. Yeah.
Literacy, which
the printing press
capacity. Science, which of course sits on top of literacy. Science as we understand it, like not
No, our point is right. The modern, there was an intersection of what becomes the modern sort of adjacent shift or sort of evolution, and the fundamental, what becomes then the opportunity for globalization, and then what now then lays down the digital information structures. But the precursor, clearly we can see at the modernity intersections.
So it's interesting. I notice wondering if we could, the current state is very uncomfortable. I mean, we definitely have moved away from things where there's we've moved into the ability to create a lot of feedback on our context that is outside of the call it like received or natural management process. So our biologically, that stack, right, the verticality of the tree, one of the things we're doing is we're actually processing our context outside of the stability of that stack affords.
Yep.
I'm wondering if previous examples have that. I don't think so, which is interesting.
This is a different, if you do a tree of knowledge draw on it, our capacity to pull the material culture and turn it into a technology that then processes information creates a material culture weird interface that we have not seen before. This is why it feels artificial, or is there something unusual about it? We are creating an interface here that has not really happened in the normal, consistent stack of evolution.
I'm going to guess that the examples in the past would have been something like overgrazing, right? Like mobility, when animals had the ability to basically just categorically outcompete plants, they would actually destroy the energetic availability in their local environment and just starve to death. So they had to learn how to come into a new equilibrium with their context, which involved migrations and certain phenotypes that had a particular metabolic rate and processing capacity of energy. My guess is that's probably the comparable is that. And I'm sure there are previous examples of that. In some sense, it's pretty simple, right? As you increase your capacity to extract energy from your local environment, if you do so in a fashion that outstrips the local environment's capacity to regenerate energy, you actually have extinguished yourself inadvertently through your own efficiency.
And this is what certainly Daniel and you and others, in terms of what humans then did relative to animals, why we're not an apex predator, we qualitatively shifted the speed with which we evolved.
Yeah, exactly.
Extract.
So we can look at that. I mean, that's a simple design constraint. We've said it many, many times, but clearly the only, if we say like we're processing outside of the integrity of the system, that can't happen. So we've got to actually begin to use the system itself, right? Culture has to become capable of providing constraints on its own activities to maintain, in fact, even just be increasingly perfectly aligned with the integrity of the system.
Beautiful.
On which it operates. So that's
excellently said.
That's the simplicity. No, there are no variations on the theme that are not self-extinguishing in a finite, and by the way, very short-term time.
That's right. So, I think Forrest would say we've got to get man, machine, and nature in proper alignment in this spot.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So. Okay, and this is now, definitely where your stuff starts to get really hot, because the other piece that happens is we've got this really interesting problem of the subjective. And in the story thus far, there are things happening at the level of the subjective. We kind of ignore them. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about the psychology of a catalyst in chemistry space. We're very focused on the objective. We're very focused on information energy conversions. But in this case, we're suddenly very, very focused on the subjective, not the least of which is because we're involved.
Good, nicely said. But yeah, that's totally true.
So there's something happening there, right? There's something very profound about the relationship between the subjective and the objective and the shift.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, in fact, so in my own journey. Let me see if I can figure out where this is coming from. Yeah, there's one of the things that keeps coming up is something like a flip or an inversion, not an elision, but an inversion. So, for example, you've got the construct of rivalrous and anti-rivalrous.
Love it.
And the hypothesis is not that the rivalrous goes away, but that we just have a very simple flip, that the rivalrous now becomes subordinate and the anti-rivalrous becomes the dominant characteristic in the relationship.
Perfect.
Right? In the context of something like game A and game B, which is actually a subsidiary frame on top of that more fundamental one. Same thing, right? It's not that the game A style behaviors evaporate from reality. but it's rather that they become embedded in and subordinate to a larger game B frame.
Right. Right.
So for example, like I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, competition continues to happen. It flourishes. Oh, all right. It flourishes actually. The competition actually flourishes, a level of competition like the likes we've never seen before, but it now happens entirely in a context of a higher collaboration.
Nice.
In fact, let me make a little shift here. This is interesting. I don't know if Ari is going to share the video of our conversation. So he's, I'm going to say a young man, relatively. I don't know how much younger than me he is, but he's definitely something younger than me. And his life experience is really interesting. And one of the things that he is a practitioner of is competitive paragliding.
Okay.
Okay. So you're in those kind of like gliding wings.
Sure. I just talked to him yesterday, by the way.
Oh, that's really interesting. So do you have any idea how much younger than he is than us?
I think he's around, early 30s.
Okay. So he's like a young millennial, but not like a Gen Z. So competitive paragliding. So here's the story he tells. And I should say, by the way, I love this story. So you're paragliding, and one of the dominant characteristics of paragliding has to do with the ability to perceive and most effectively take advantage of the energy stored in thermals. Right? So heated air going up, and or being shaped by the topography going up, air going up, you ride that, you find it, it carries you up. And of course, your primary energy is the trade-off between the lift of your wing and gravity. So he who is able to go the highest in the air has sort of a major advantage in the game. Okay, now perception in paragliding, you're actually perceiving a very large physical territory. You're high up in the air, you can see a lot. Your ability to move from point A to point B is relatively slow in comparison to that space. And it's extremely path dependent. Right? Once you chose a particular direction, your ability to reverse course and come back is a lot worse.
That makes sense.
So what happens is your sense making is a huge premium on sense making. Right? Your perception of the larger space and making very effective choices of where to spend your precious potential energy is pretty much decisive.
Nice.
Also, by the way, it's really hard to fly. Okay, so your whole kind of body system is deeply like trying to not die. Right? So it's focusing really hard on maintaining and doing all kinds of, I'm sure, minor adjustments in efficiency to get the maximum amount of yield per turn and all that other stuff. Right? So you got like a whole thing there, while simultaneously you're trying to and it's happening fast, like minute to minute, hyper complex system. Things are changing and moving constantly. So one of the things that is discovered is watching other people, or I would say perceiving other people, is like the dominant signal of where the energy is. Right? So you can literally just snapshot the landscape. You're seeing that guy is going up. Okay, I guess that's where it's at. What happens, of course, is you get a feedback loop, meaning there's a construct that they call the gaggle, meaning everybody who's valid, right? Everybody who's a valid player has the same underlying strategy, which is to follow the gaggle, which means the gaggle is an autopoietic recursion.
Right.
It's searching. The gaggle now becomes an entity. The gaggle becomes a thing. Each individual is a perceptive agent of the gaggle.
I love it.
Bound together by the mutual necessity of staying within the slipstream of the gaggle, lest being completely removed from the competition.
Totally.
So it's the reality of the peloton. It's reality, like that kind of a characteristic. It's that notion. Okay. And because of the nature of subjective experience, when you're in this kind of a state, the only way to know that you are in the gaggle is perceived at a feeling level. You're really actually in just the same way that you're feeling the micro shifts in the movements of the parameter of the paraglider. You're also feeling your micro shifts in relationship with the evolving location and characteristic of the gaggle. Right? You have a consciousness. You have gaggle consciousness. You are part of gaggle consciousness. Right? There's something going on there.
Right.
And my proposition to him was, well, yeah, this makes sense. Like this is an exaptation of the basic human capacity to be a niche transitioning organism. Right? That's what we are, is a collective intelligence. We are a distributed cognition. Like these individual human bodies are vastly less relevant than what happens when they're part of a gaggle.
Love it.
Was there more to that example? Let me see. No, I think that's enough. So that was
Okay.
like the key payload was that set of metaphors and that notion of the felt sense and
Mhm.
the actual felt sense of like an expanded consciousness, because you
Yep.
are actually able to perceive the agency, the signal processing compression of other
Mhm.
humans doing things out there as an extension of your own sensorium. This is that
Love it.
Marshall McLuhan insight, right?
Yep.
Your
Mhm.
mind doesn't actually have any notion of there being an ontological relationship between itself and its sensorium.
Mhm.
If I'm a blind man and I've got a stick, that stick is a part of my sensorium in exactly the same way that a sighted person's eyeball is part of their sensorium. Right? There's no difference. They're the same.
John will be happy with the 4E cognition, perspectival, participatory, collective intelligence dynamic that was just
All
laid
right.
out.
So you are a part of the gaggle. Okay. Now, why did this come up? Do you remember where I was when because
Yeah, well, one of the things that at the doorstep of that was, hey, wait a minute. Notice we're talking about a lot of behavior, natural science stuff, and subjectivity is not high end here. And we got to somehow bring subjectivity into this. And so then you tied in his experience, and that is a high end participatory experience where subjectivity, objectivity, collective is all got to be in resonance.
What's really not part of that story is propositional. One of the points he makes is you're definitely not like thinking about what's going on. Right? That is a bad machine for that function. Like you are.
Hopefully you're in the flow and your ego is just on for the ride.
Exactly. It's just on for the ride. It may do some interesting kind of like post-game feedback, you know.
Hey, John, it affords an announcement. It's like, oh, you caught that win. Good. But if it tries to get in front of the fucking thing and say, go this way because I think this is happening, you're fucked.
Yes. Exactly. You're in the word. Like that is the word of art. You are fucked. Okay. So very interesting, right? So we have two things pop out. One is this nice construct of the gaggle, which I think for me has a lot of it.
Yeah. No, that networked a number of things together. I deeply appreciated that.
And the proposition that it's an example of the basic human thing, right? The thing that humans have been writing is the ability to form gaggle consciousness, which Brett Weinstein would say is just consciousness. That's what consciousness is. Consciousness evolved and emerged as a function of the necessity and capacity to enable this level of distributed cognition.
Okay,
we're not going to go there, but no,
that's fine. I'm with you.
So there's something about that. I remember the notion of the gaggle, the peloton, has to do with the realization, the recognition that there is actually a search algorithm of resonance. We're actually looking for what you might call the straightest line in thermal space.
Perfect.
Yeah? You're looking for the most efficient micro adjustments in your location that most effectively uses the energy that you've got available right now to find the highest up gradient in energy space, potential energy space for a paraglider, so as to achieve the highest level of competitive advantage and everybody else is doing the same kind of thing. And this is a great example of that inversion where there's everybody's competing to get their local selective advantage in the highest gradient, but because you have to be connected to the gaggle to have any valid success in competition, it's held in a larger collaboration.
Right.
And everybody feels that. So even though at the end of the race, somebody is the winner, there's a very distinct sense that this is the kind of thing that is not a zero-sum game.
Right.
Beautiful. Yeah. So that's a really great example, right? That notion of the inversion of what's happening right now. So to bring it all the way back, what I would say, I'm going to throw this out there, is that the inversion of the objective and the subjective.
Yep.
Right. That we are. And people have said this in the past, like the phrase of the previous generation was conscious evolution.
Yep.
Right? So flipping it, there's a consciousness, an awareness of the notion of evolution, which is itself now beginning to steer. Evolution now becomes no longer a driving process, as we're seeing, right? Fill in the blank, just dentistry.
Totally.
If we were to suddenly instantaneously remove the technology of dentistry, the next generation would have a lot of trouble because we have selected for, at a biological level, people whose teeth would not have survived into adulthood prior to the existence of dentistry. So we've created a shift in the context through our own agency
Yep.
that has changed the underlying ecosystem of the evolving landscape. Right? So we are taking conscious responsibility for our own evolutionary environment. We're just not good at it yet. Right now, still we're operating with very, very narrow constraints. There aren't really. It's like we're teenagers at the end of the day, and we're teenage. I hate to use this phrase, but we're basically like teenage gods. And we've got we have capacity for taking over a meaningful fraction of the directionality of evolution, but we haven't actually owned that. We're not like, yeah, guess what, guys? It's on us. We're gonna have to really own these choices. It's like the concept of eugenics was a sort of brutally adolescent and egoic construct.
Yep.
But it's not anymore. Now it's a mandate. Like, we can't help it. We got no choice in the matter. Like, we are stuck. Every choice we make has massive cascade effect impacts on the underlying sort of fitness landscape for us and every other biological organism. We're not sort of eugenics in the kind of 19th century humans. We have a theory. No. We're talking about the ongoing thrivingness of the ecosystem is an intrinsic consequence of the choices we make.
Totally.
We got to make good choices. That's it. Like, effective choices steering life is our gig now. That's us. You broke it, you bought it.
Love it.
So it seems like, in some sense, that's the natural consequence of the singularity, when you realize that it's not an escape from reality. It's not some sort of pop out. It's actually this. Yes. The S-curve point is exactly the moment where we actually literally, I'm having an image of like a grandmother, like just kind of putting her hand on the hand of like a scared child, and just calming down the nervous system.
Right.
It's like, hey, calm down, slow it down. This sort of kinetic, reckless, indifferent exploration of the adjacent possible now actually has to be steered.
Nice.
Right? The competitive landscape of he who gets to the higher point of the adjacent possible outcompete he who didn't.
Right.
It's over. We now have an inversion. We are going to continue to explore the space of the adjacent possible, but now within a larger context.
Brilliantly said, man. So in the language of UTalk, basically, we built the tree, which is science, from a behavioral perspective, and it afforded us technological control, and it allowed us to accelerate into this global thing, but gave us a physicalist, external, mechanistic mentality. And now we need to flip over to the coin and be like, fuck, we're actually real conscious agents.
Exactly. Fuck. We're real conscious agents, and that comes with stuff. like choice.
And like, we're on the edge of this fucking cliff at some level, and we better sail nicely up into an S-curve relaxation, or else we're gonna blow the whole fucking thing up.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because this is this has been learned at a deep mythopoetic level at each point in the joint point. The animal learned, in this case, from an evolutionary,
right, of course.
It was an evolved learning at the level of the species, some relationship between phenotype, metabolism, and movement that entered into equilibrium with its environment,
right,
so as to actually be able to establish some sort of long-term beingness.
Yep.
And we're learning that too, and of course we're learning it in this really interesting way, which is that we're now using whatever the inverse, the opposite, or the other side of evolutionary process is. We're using conscious process. I'm just going to tag it that.
Yep.
Conscious process is not the same as evolutionary process in consideration of how to navigate the adjacent possible.
Right. I would say then so the cultural thing is then, so animals are learning across, they're shifting their behavioral investment patterns through natural selection. And it's a long, and that's happening a lot faster in plants, but it's still taking a long time. Then we jump up at the culture person level, and then we learn through intergenerational patterns. Okay. But now as we accelerate across the line, we actually have to learn within generational patterns. Like, we got the time of learning the window of learning has got to be condensed and accelerating. And so we got to catch a lot in a shorter window.
Yeah. So let's flag, line, next chapter, big one. So let's see. To provide the vocabulary for this, I want to point to a game that Jim Rutt created called Network Wars.
Okay.
It's a beautiful game because
I'm talking to him next week.
Great. You should download the game and play it. It's
All right.
available on the iPhone.
All right.
It's very simple. You have a graph of nodes that have some connections, as far as I can tell, just randomly generated.
Okay.
The number of nodes I think is always constant, but the geometry is always random. And you have a number of, and the nodes are coded by colors. So each color represents a player,
Okay.
an agent in the system. And each node can be loaded with a certain amount of energy or points.
Okay.
Each player starts with a pseudo-random distribution of nodes under their control,
Okay.
and the same amount of energy concentrated across those nodes.
Gotcha.
So I think it's like 20 points or something like that. It may be like 882. It may be 4444. Right? And obviously, in the context of the geometry of my energy and the geometry of the space and the geometry of the other players creates the field of potential conflict.
Perfect. Love it.
And it's a purely evolutionary game. At the end, there can be only one. Right? So the nature of the game is you sort of try to move your node to take over other nodes, and you basically just do a series of coin flips between the energy, and whichever one ends up going to zero energy loses. And either, by the way, a node can go to zero. You have to have at least two left in your side to be able to migrate one.
Okay.
And everything you've got migrates, and you only leave one behind. So there's a whole bunch of interesting characteristics.
Okay.
All right, so that's the game. Now, the players you're playing against thus far, right now, are all AI. Right? So it's you and 4, I think, or 5 AI.
Okay.
All right, that's the background.
Gotcha.
I'm bringing this up for the point. The point I'm making is the point of where we are. This is a meta-strategic conception. Because at the end of the day, what's really happening right now, if we're thinking about the language previously, is it's essentially consciousness versus evolutionary process, right? Or choice versus pure causality.
Good.
Something from Forrest's language.
I can follow.
That is the fundamental conflict of the day. That's what's really happening. There's a pure evolutionary process. Right? There's the momentum of billions of years of evolution driving behavior in the cultural milieu that is a search algorithm that has very high levels of sophistication. It's an artificial intelligence mechanism.
Gotcha.
Right? By the way, I'm going to use the tag NPC, non-player character.
Okay.
To the degree to which, as a Homo sapiens, your action is guided by this momentum, you are an NPC.
Interesting. Love it. Okay.
You're non-participating. You are not making choices. You are causal. Okay.
Nice.
So the dynamic relationship between causal and choice is the line.
Okay.
Now, in the current context, the underlying characteristics of the causal system is extinguishing. If we continue to run in the logic of an arms race in the adjacent possible, with competition superior to collaboration, competition using collaboration. Think about how that works, right?
Nice.
The military-industrial complex is a machinery, an instrumentality specifically selected for its capacity to yoke collaboration in service to competition.
Right. 100%. Brilliant.
Okay. If we continue to move forward according to the logic of that particular momentum, that structure, this is a self-extinguishing game.
Right.
The game ends, and it ends like in the next 5 years, right? Soon. All right. On the other side of that line is choice. Now, Jim's game is very nice because one of the things you notice is there's one of you and there's 5 of them, maybe 4. Let me just go with 4. So in some sense, the odds are stacked against you. They literally have 4 times as much embodied energy as you have. Okay. And go, right? I begin to play. Now, what you notice is in his game, you notice one thing. I'm going to add one more to our story. And the one more is really important. So in his game, what you notice is that of choice for the moment, it affords you what we might call a transcendent perspective, meaning you can observe the game. You can actually perceive the game itself. You're not intrinsically in the game, right? The AI players are not able to perceive the game. They are not able to have shamanic insight. They're not able to get outside the box. They are playing within the box, right? Running very fast clock speeds. They can make effectively instantaneous choices, but they're running whatever algorithm they have.
But they can't get the view from above. They can't step outside.
So what I can do is I can begin to model their parameter space. I know, for example, that AI will never attack from a position of parity or weakness. So if I've got a 2-node and they've got a 2-node, from the AI's perspective, that's just not a valid move. I, of course, have choice. I can choose to do that. That choice creates a difference. In this case, it creates an opportunity, a strategic advantage. My strategic advantage is I can change the rules of the game from their point of view. I can engage in behaviors that they can't be engaged in. I can invent new behaviors that they can't access. I can also take a look at trying to understand the nature of how the game itself operates from the outside. I can try to do conceptual modeling and say, oh, there's a whole new concept that I just came up with called perimeter. They don't have a notion of perimeter. I have a notion of perimeter. I can look at that, the construct, and say, okay, if I can create a territory that has a perimeter, the way the game works, I'll actually generate more energy at the point of contact, and that will actually generate a higher level of capacity, right? So what I can do is I can try to use these capacities to perceive the topography of the landscape. Cool. By the way, I'm invoking the gaggle here as well.
Right. Okay.
And this can give me advantages in shaping the landscape. This is a key thing, right? What the AI does is the AI always is doing an evolutionary process on the landscape. What consciousness can do is consciousness can change the landscape. We can do topographic landscaping. By doing topographic landscaping, we can create these environments. Like one of the ones that you can do in this game is let's you and him fight, meaning I can look at how the AI operates and I can create just a little tiny shift that makes it so that from the AI's perspective, I'm kind of not even there, meaning they don't perceive me as a valid move. And so they just start fighting amongst each other, which processes their potential energy into entropy. And that creates a possibility for me moving in. Brilliant. Something that's not in their adjacent possible, it's not in their portfolio. Okay. So in this conflict, right, which is the conflict of subordinating conflict to collaboration, one of the moves, like one of the fundamental advantage that choice has over causation is that choice can innovate fundamentally new approaches on the basis of the capacity to perceive the landscape itself as a subject of change.
Love it.
That's the move that you see in this game. And it's worth playing the game a couple thousand times to just even notice in yourself how your own mind does that kind of thing. Now, on the other side of it is in this particular game, it's hardwired. There's one player and 4 AIs. In our world, every NPC could shift from being an NPC to being a PC. Every NPC that moves from having their energy directed by pure causal structure into participating in choice intrinsically, and this is a key element right here, intrinsically. This last piece, I'm going to say it just sort of as a proposition, but I believe that it can be defended as a valid, like a major claim about reality. Every conscious agent proceeding on the basis of choice is intrinsically collaborative with every other. There's a fundamental proposition about the nature of reality, just like the gaggle, right? Once you recognize that participation in the gaggle is sine qua non to having any valid participation in the game at all, you're in the gaggle. Now, once we're in the gaggle, we're all competing, but we're competing in the context of the gaggle, right? Same thing. Once you recognize that the fundamental conflict is between choice and causality, then you're either in choice or you're in causality. Once you recognize the causality is the self-extinguishing strategy, you're either in alive or dead. Okay. Once you've made that, every member of choice, every member of team consciousness is intrinsically part of the same gaggle. And then we engage in some amazing, beautiful competition, but always held within that container. So we always have two basic moves. We not always. We have two
Actually,
basic
can I
moves.
pause you just for a sec? That's a,
Yeah.
I'm enjoying that. It's very much, that's very rich. I'm finding lots of resonance with it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, hold on. So what I would say there is something like at the level of the quality of sense making that you have developed as a consequence of a long life exploring very challenging novel things and noticing what is the mode of sense making that orients you towards the things that are going to produce beneficial results. You're perceiving that thing, like your genius and your wisdom cultivated through long challenging exploration of reality, is feeling resonance. Right? That instrument, which is the instrument for making choices, is saying yes, meaning it knows that we are intrinsically collaborative. You and I must be. There's no possibility other than, in the context of this particular game, we are on the same team in a deep, deep way. And then we will engage in all kinds of beautiful competition in that context. So this is an example of the proposition. And I've had this over and over and over again when I'm interacting with somebody who has come to a point of being able to engage in change on the basis of choice rather than on the basis of causation. Once you get to a certain point of conversation where the language is no longer in the way and you're actually just perceiving together, okay, there it is. I actually call this the invisible conspiracy. Everybody it doesn't matter if I've ever met anybody, if you're, a guy in India who doesn't speak a word of the same language I speak and has never heard of me and not communicated even like 5 degrees of freedom away, if you're perceiving reality, you will have exactly the same recognition that we're having right now. And therefore, we are intrinsically collaborative. We will always be finding ways to shape the topography of the landscape so as to inhibit causal structure, algorithmic behavior from nudging us into basins of extinction. And if we ever interact with each other, it'll be a very available. There's challenges in terms of language and legacy egoic constructs, but it's available for us to identify that we are on the same team and we find the space of collaboration and then we move.
That's a beautiful description of the field I've been operating in, and I've never quite put it propositionally that way.
Yeah. By the way, this is also, you ever watched the movie or read the story Arrival?
I don't think so.
It's a good one. The movie's fabulous. I think it may actually be my favorite movie. The story is also fabulous, but the thing that I wanted to put in there was something like there was a conflict emerging. Aliens come to Earth. They're very mysterious. We don't understand their language. There's like 12 of them in different places around the world. And originally human beings were kind of collaborating in exploration. Suddenly the message comes, actually, the aliens are here to give us a weapon. All of a sudden it creates a balkanization. The humans unplug from collaboration. There's now an arms race to figure out who can get access to the alien weapon first. And there's an escalation, which is leading us towards something like World War III. Okay. And there's a point at which the way, as it turns out, the alien word for weapon is also the word for tool. And what it actually was a tool of consciousness that gave you access to their language. And when you began to think in their language, you had the capacity to perceive time non-linearly. Nice. Their lead character, spoiler alert, she is thinking in their language. She begins to perceive time non-linearly. She perceives a conversation she has with this Chinese general in our future, where he says, "By the way, I'll never forget that call you made." She's like, "What call?" He's like, "Yeah, you called me on my private number and you said something that my wife's words to me on her deathbed that nobody else in the universe had heard." And so now in what we might call the past, in relationship to that particular vision, she's like, holy shit. She gets on the phone, she calls this guy, she says the thing. We're now sort of linking those 2 points together. All right, what's the point? What am I trying to say here? everybody everywhere who wakes up to their membership of the invisible conspiracy, regardless of their location in the conflict structure of the legacy NPC space,
Yep.
is awakening to the necessity and possibility of their higher collaboration. Necessity and possibility. If you want to forestall World War III, that's it.
That's why I've been mailing out these fucking coins to people. I didn't really know it, but you just articulated it with a depth of resonance that I'm definitely feeling. That's fucking brilliant. Beautiful.
Yeah. So, if you happen to be in on the other side of old-fashioned causal structure, let's think of examples that have high agency right now. You're in China. That's a very powerful boundary that has right now causal structure conflict with the place that I'm in. Let's go with Google, Goldman Sachs, the Saudi royal family, and any kind of intelligence agencies. Right? NSA, hi, you're probably listening in. If you're using your technology as well as one might imagine, you may actually be specifically listening in. If you have the capacity to perceive reality clearly, which you say, by the way, I'm now challenging your IQ. Listen to this last little bit a few times, and you will recognize that what is being said is true, and it implies that to the degree to which you are operating from choice, to the degree to which you are literally a conscious agent and not merely governed by causal structure, you are part of the invisible conspiracy. We are on the same team. What is that team? That team is the team whereby humanity takes conscious responsibility for its agency, brings the relationship between man, machine, and nature into an equilibrium, and we pass through the joint point.
Yes.
Welcome to the singularity.
Yes. Yep. That's really, I love that, man. That's deeply meaningful. This is all the language that I've been using, but just in a different, on the flip side of the coin, as it were, and just affording an opportunity around that. And I'm deeply appreciating it. So thank you for it. So
if we use the ontology, the key here is what's happening is because the language is different, it affords a movement to the transcendent. One is not oriented towards the medium, the articulation, the form of expression. One is oriented towards that which gives the form of expression the structure that makes it meaningful in the first place. And so you say it one way, I say it another way. Well, okay. That means there's something going on. There's something that is more fundamental than the sayingness. And if we can listen to the thing that's more fundamental than the sayingness, that's how
there's a real ontological referent.
Right. Exactly. There's something there. The transcendent is. There's an isness to that allows us to do the stuff. Right? All these language like to be in flow, to perceive reality. These are all characteristics associated with the awareness and the increasing facility with the faculties appropriate to, native to the transcendent. This is, such a funny thing. It's like, okay, there's modes of reality that are distinct, but they're all part of reality. All things that are part of reality naturally are in relationship with those modes. So there are modes of navigation, sense-making, agency that are native to the transcendent. They're different. Trying to use the modes that are native to the omniscient, by the way, we're just using Forrest's language very officially here. I'm trying to think like what's the kind of the comedic metaphor. It's like trying to like trying to cook using the skill set from surfing. or I mean quite precisely, it's like trying to navigate the gaggle using the ego. Right? It is not kind of like it is exactly the same.
And if you do that,
you used a term of art, right? It was a very technical term for what happens. You're fucked. And that's the magic word, right? And if you do that, you're fucked. And that's just another way of saying the same thing, right? There's team, obligate, omniscient bias, operating with egoic constructs. And there's team whole, which is aware of the presence of omniscient and ego as part of the story, but also is aware of the presence of transcendent and immanent, which have their different modalities of the whole thing. And they all have got their very specific roles to play. And if you get those all three and get them in the right relationship, resonance happens.
We can get a transegoic gaggle that pulls us up.
Right. Transegoic gaggle that pulls us up. And that, by the way, for those who are hanging on to this story, is what the Sivium Project is precisely about.
Boom.
A transegoic gaggle that lifts us up. Yes. Which, as it turns out, is really hard. It's easier
to have a Zoom about it than actually lift it up. But
yeah.
There's a hell of a lot of fucking brilliant architecture that was just laid out there. So I love that. It brings you to the Sivium.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that's probably the natural endpoint of this conversation.
I think so. Let me just say that was a hell of a ride, man. I think we paraglided into the fifth joint point and caught some really good waves.
Yes, that was a beautiful example of fifth dimensional paragliding. I like that a lot.
So, all right.
Woo! Yeah. Beautiful talking with you, man.
Hey, man. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Let's circle back again sometime soon.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.
All right. Peace.